We start. Yeah, that's as we start. Yes. Thanks for. We are here at Index at this moment. This is the last day for editorial thinking. This exhibition that has been with us for a couple of months, dealing with the idea of the editorial. What's how do we relate to the world? How do we edit? How do we observe reality? And how artists are doing these things, how editors are also understanding an artistic position. We have had several situations here and several artists and collectives being part of this exhibition. And for this last weekend, we have had a focus on the book lovers. Here we can see some books. It's a collection of more than 500 novels written by artists. Are they written by artists? Are they artist novels? This is a good question. And the two ones behind the book lovers are Joanna Zielinska and David Maroto. We had a performance yesterday with David. He was doing a book for 5 hours and 30 minutes. And some people was producing their own copies of this book. But today, for this last moment of the exhibition, we are really happy to have to see the presence of Goldin+Senneby. Goldin+Senneby were here at Index many years ago. I think it was 2009. That there was this fantastic exhibition about Headless, this enormous project dealing with incredible ideas related to economy and philosophy that had a novel also as an important element, defining multiple connections with many agents. To start this session, we will hear first some words from David Maroto from the Book Lovers. David?
Yes, thank you, Martí. Yeah, hello, everyone. And thank you for being here with us today. I'm David Maroto, like Martí said. I'm an artist and I collaborate with curator Joanna Zielinska. We've been working together for 10 years now under the name of The Book Lovers. So The Book Lovers is a research project on the artist novel. As its base, we have created a bibliography and collection of artist novels that has been acquired by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp. And this collection has been part of an exhibition at Index, the Swedish Contemporary Art Foundation in Stockholm, which is the place we are speaking from now. You can see the collection has been, like Martí said, here on view and also open for public perusal, a collection of artist novels. And yeah, we would like to express again our gratitude to Martí and to the whole team of Index, actually. So the notion of artist novel is not exactly about a novel that has been written by a visual artist. It applies to those instances in which a novel is employed as a medium in the visual arts that an artist could use exactly like installation, performance, or video, for example. From this point of view, the Swedish duo of artists, Goldin+Senneby, have been since the beginning a key case study in our research. In 2013, when I say we, I mean Joanna and I, the book lovers, we organized a symposium on the artist novel in the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. And we invited Goldin+Senneby. They sent a spokesman, Angus Cameron, who gave a presentation of the fascinating project that Martí already mentioned, Headless, which was in progress at the time. That same year, we created a group exhibition in the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts in New York City. And we also included a work by Goldin+Senneby. And again, well, it was a secret meeting in a Rigus rental room. And this performance, again, was related to the creative process of Headless, the artist novel. More recently, I wrote an entire chapter about Headless in my own PhD. thesis, and this chapter appears now in a book that has been published by Moose Publishing. The artist novel, the novel as a medium in the visual arts. That's the full title. So I'm mentioning this history of collaboration also to stress our admiration for the work. So this is to say that we are really delighted to learn, we were delighted to learn that they have embarked in the creation of a new artist novel titled Crying Pine Tree. And we are happy to host and to contribute in some measure to the development of this new artist novel. This project is initiated by Goldin+Senneby, of course, in collaboration with fiction writer Katie Kitamura, featuring autoimmune tree as the main protagonist. More specifically, it draws on bodily experiences of living with an autoimmune condition and a growing discomfort with the very language that frames such a condition. The lecture performance that follows in a second is called A Thorn in the Side. And it has been conceived within the research and narrative frame in the development of Crying Pine Tree. In preparation for an upcoming journey of the artist to Messina in Sicily, together with Katie Kitamura and Ed Cohen, who is a psychosynthetic healer. And this trip has the goal to search for the origins of biological immunity. And this trip should be happening soon in the next months. Could reimagining possible and impossible meetings between starfish and tangerine trees help us find a different language for our bodily conditions and how they fold into their surroundings? We are about to find out. Thank you very much.
Oh. Okay. Are we online?
Yeah.
Good. Hi, my name is Simon Goldin.
And I'm Goldin+Senneby. We work together as Goldin+Senneby. First of all, thanks to the book lovers and to Index for inviting us to speak in this context of editorial thinking. Our presentation today is about half an hour long, during which time we will try to paint an image of the origins of biological immunity. And we will also reflect on the experience of being made readable. At the end of this presentation, you're all more than welcome to ask questions. Okay, let us begin.
In the winter of 1882, a starfish larva was caught off the coast of Sicily and found itself under a microscope with a thorn in its side. Quite literally. It was a thorn taken from a nearby citrus tree and introduced under the skin of the starfish.
In the winter of 2002, I found myself inside an MRI scanner with a large needle in my arm and a thin tube pumping rare earth metal into my veins.
Our talk today borrows its title from the starfish, A Thorn in the Side. And in the course of this presentation, we will try to outline how the starfish ended up in this precarious and peculiar situation.
And how the thorn in its side affects my body till this day.
So let's begin. This is a presentation in 3 colors, or 3 stains. We start with yellow.
The first stain is picric acid. Picric acid is not really intended as a color as much as a fixative. It's a solution to hold the other colors in place and also hold the specimen in place.
The starfish larva is only a few millimeters in size. It is mostly made up of water and almost entirely transparent. And it's this quality of transparency that made it particularly attractive to 19th century scientists that were equipped with light microscopes as their primary means of investigation. The starfish larva provided a body you can see straight through prior to the invention of the X-ray.
The MRI scanner does not exactly see through, but intercepts your inner workings with radio frequencies. First, your head is fixed in place with a tight, cage-like contraption that looks like a futuristic version of Hannibal Lecter's mask. Then you are slid into the scanner. For the next hour, your only company is a loud clicking noise. I didn't make much of it the first time, as I had too many other worries on my mind. But over the years, I realized it is in there I developed my claustrophobia.
Although the see-through nature of the young starfish opens its body to plain view, contrast dye is added to make its inner workings readable to the eye of the scientist.
You can feel when they start pushing the contrast agent into your veins. It's a chilling effect. As the cold liquid moves into your lower arm, the purely sensory experience, I suppose, is quite local. But in that mental space, it's as though I can feel it diluting through my entire circulation.
The picric acid that is applied to the starfish is a highly explosive nitrate, also used in blasting charges and artillery shells.
You might already have turned this piece of aquarelle paper into an explosive, which sets the scene for our next stain, carmine.
Thorn was taken from a nearby tangerine tree and introduced under the skin of the starfish. Being devoid of both blood cells and nervous system, it's hard for us to imagine what this might have felt like for the starfish, if anything.
I remember it as a stressful period. I had started a new job and my relationship was out of balance. My partner had left for France and communication was difficult. I traveled to Paris in order to speak.
There was no bleeding to distract the scientist, but the thorn was soon surrounded by mobile cells, much like a splinter in a finger would be on a human.
It was in Paris that that my left foot went stiff. Part of my abdomen went stiff, just around the solar plexus. Actually, maybe more numb than stiff. The kind of numb, tingling sensation that you can have when your arm falls asleep. The pins and needles sensation, you know. For a moment, you can't locate your arm. You can't move it. Just this time, that moment of numbness, of paresthesia, was extended. It was too long. My foot was numb, my solar plexus was numb, and it wouldn't go away. I assumed it was psychological, related to stress, the emotional stress of my crumbling relationship.
On the other end of the microscope, zoologist Eli Mechnikov had not only inserted a humble thorn into a starfish, but introduced an entire new set of metaphors about how a living organism relates to its surroundings. Mechnikov thought of his insertion of the citrus thorn as an intrusion, and therefore interpreted the mobilization of cells in the starfish as a defensive response. It's with this experiment that Mechnikov brings to the world the idea of biological immunity as a form of defense.
2 years later, when I came out of the MRI scanner, my condition had turned into a diagnosis. They had found white spots on my brain and my spinal cord. I had multiple sclerosis, multiple scars on my nervous system.
It's hard to know if Mechnikov's assumptions about intrusion and defense had anything to do with his own vulnerabilities at the time, or if his warlike metaphors were merely a reflection of the zeitgeist. As a Russian Jew, he had hastily left his home and university position in Odessa earlier that year, following a flare-up of anti-Semitic pogroms, and was living in exile in Sicily.
The testing accelerated after the diagnosis. The doctors seemed obsessed with the spots on my brain. For my own part, I was fully occupied with trying to hide my condition from myself and from others.
Prior to the starfish on Sicily, immunity was almost exclusively a legal and political term, invented in ancient Rome, as in a person being above the law while holding certain office. And the notion of self-defense as a natural right is first introduced in Hobbes' political theory, written in the context of the English Civil War.
I developed all kinds of elaborate defense strategies to conceal my loss of abilities. It took me years of awkward moments, groups waiting, people in a hurry. I still avoided the subject. I remember that evening after an opening in 2011. We were all going to a restaurant. It was only a few blocks away, but it was too far. I tried my usual tricks, the engaging small talk, the micropauses, the looking at the evening sky. But it wasn't enough. I just couldn't walk any further. We were already halfway there, so turning around was not an option.
Introducing the combined metaphor of immunity as defense into biology implicitly characterizes life as war by other means, in a way which no previous medical theory had done.
When the doctors finally got me to start taking medication, they were very pleased. Each year, they could confirm how well it worked, how the scarring on my nervous system had slowed down, if not completely, halted. They were counting the spots on the MRI scans and showed me comparative images with no new spots. The only problem was that this was not my experience. I wanted to talk about losing touch with perception, about the outside world entering slower, about how the numbness in touch in my legs had extended to my other senses.
The addition of auto to immunity, as in autoimmunity, conceptualized in the 1950s, harks back on Mechnikov's metaphor and introduces the biological ability to discriminate between self and non-self as the central figure, at which the autoimmune body is supposedly failing. This figure further fortifies the image of the body in a binary and antagonistic relationship to its surroundings, and suggests the autoimmune condition as being at war with oneself.
Multiple sclerosis is considered an autoimmune condition, since parts of the immune system are thought to be causing the scarring of the nervous system. But is this a civil war? Is it me attacking myself? And if so, what notion of self are we mobilizing?
Once you're stained by a metaphor, it can be hard to wash off. I remember we were in London together after one of your MRI scans, and you'd been talking about this feeling that all the doctors could see were spots. They could only see what they were looking for, you said, spots. I didn't really understand what you were trying to get at, but in the evening, we went to the theater to see a production of Macbeth. It wasn't very good, and you fell asleep during the play, I believe. But there is this one famous scene towards the end where Lady Macbeth walks in her sleep and in her dreams tries to wash off the invisible blood from her hands while sleep talking this monologue, out, damned spot. Somehow in that moment, it became clear to me what you were trying to say was that the doctors were not actually looking inside of you, but only looking at their own diagnosis, and that you felt like the spots they saw were the stains of the so-called civil war they had conceived of, or rather, the civil war that was preconceived in the very language of autoimmunity.
I also remember that evening. I'm not sure things were quite as articulate for me yet, not in words. After all, I'm more the sleep-talking type. But over the years, I've started to grow uncomfortable with this language that frames my condition. A sense that the metaphors themselves are a thorn in the side.
I think it's time for our final spot. Mechnikov used both carmine and indigo dissolved in picric acid. Here comes the stain of indigo.
These days, I've come to terms with my limited mobility, but I struggle with my working memory. I feel like I'm fading into the background, and the world around me becomes these disparate events that no longer fits together in a coherent whole, or disparate events that are sewn together in new and unexpected combinations. My condition becomes surreal. I notice it, for example, when I read or listen to a book. I think I'm reading when words start jumping and appearing in random order. I read one thing and something else appears. The overall plot rarely makes sense to me. I find it hard to reproduce what I've read as a coherent argument. I compare to Simon. When we read Julabis's book on immunity, Simon gave it to me, the book, and described it as a kind of cultural history of vaccination. He then wanted us to discuss something about how he thought it overlooked some aspects of vaccination and colonial history.
Whereas Jakob read the same book and wanted to discuss this one remarkable scene where Biss likens immunity to a tidal wave. He had this beautiful elaboration on Biss's understanding of the immunological self as a constant ebb and flow with its surroundings. He said it was like painting watercolors, wet on wet. I had never heard Jakob talk about painting before, and it was a part of the book which I had no recollection of. So I went home and reread the book twice, then did an in-book Google search for ebb, flow, tide, water, ocean, painting, etc. The closest I could find was a handful of references to Lake Michigan. Ice flows on Lake Michigan. The mothers I meet on the beaches of Lake Michigan. The March wind blowing off Lake Michigan and through our apartment. And finally, going out on a canoe of bent wood on Lake Michigan. I concluded that Eula lives or used to live close to Lake Michigan. But there was no more clue as to the supposed tidal conception of immunological self flowing in and out of focus.
Let's be clear. This is not a presentation against metaphor. I, for one, could make no sense of the world without metaphor. My problem is the view through the microscope. This laboratory perspective makes the mobile cells in the starfish and the white spots on my brain readable. But the same perspective obscures the underlying metaphors.
Therefore, it's probably no coincidence that the immunologist who most radically rethought these metaphorical assumptions had to leave the laboratory to do so. In the early 1990s, immunologist Polly Matzinger made her entire research group step out of their laboratory and spend 9 months studying chaos theory, after which her lab became known as the Ghost Lab.
What Matzinger came up with was the danger model. It completely does away with the idea that the immune system relates to some pre-existing notion of self and its ability to detect foreignness. No, instead, our danger model suggests that the immune system responds to danger, not to foreignness. It responds to signals of bad cell death and requires no assumption of self or non-self. Her metaphor is that of a fire department instead of some military defense unit or racist police force.
Today, 3 decades after Matzinger's danger model, there's a whole set of new models and metaphors to explain the immune system. Many of them underlining the wide variety of partly overlapping activities of the immune system. The immune system not only defends the organism against potential threats or dangers, but it also constructs, repairs, and cleans up the organism, among other activities.
And this is done in symbiotic cooperation with all kinds of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, that co-inhabit our so-called selves. This symbiotic relationship to our microbiome was actually the focus of Metchnikoff's late work, of which he was ridiculed at the time. That has become the hot topic of biology and immunology 100 years later.
Yet, in a wider cultural understanding, the war metaphors persist, and the notion of self-defense against foreign threats persist everywhere in our culture, even among pharmaceutical companies and doctors. I remember listening to this program on Swedish public radio last year about immune defense. And this doctor and researcher who teaches immunology at medical school retells how one of his students once came up and asked him why there are so many war metaphors when explaining the immune system. He took this to heart and decided that for the rest of the course, he would explain immunological processes using the metaphor of care workers instead. But he said it became so complicated that after only 1 day, the student came back to him and asked him to revert to the familiar language of war and defense.
Other kinds of metaphors just don't have the same sticking power as war when it comes to the immune system. And trust us, we've been looking for other metaphors.
I have a sense that the language of economics is increasingly slipping into our bodies, where the different activities of the immune system are allocated according to a cost-benefit model, and there are opportunity costs for prioritizing one immunological function over another. Maybe we could imagine a future where pathologies become characterized as a problem of the balance sheet.
And I've been drawn to the metaphor of the garden, which have come from the last 2 decades of research on the microbiota, the ecological communities of microorganisms co-inhabiting our bodies. These metaphors suggest a future paradigm where, rather than waging war on our immune deficiencies, we will find ways of better tending to them and growing our inner gardens.
But considering how the notion of the microbiome has become commodified and commercialized in recent years, with Silicon Valley startups offering snapshots of your gut bacteria and personalized diets and medications based on these, we could also imagine some future mutation of these two metaphorical realms, where the immune system is thought of as an agro-business or a hydroponic farming startup.
But we are not in the business of suggesting new metaphors. And we also think metaphors can, and we also don't think metaphors can be done away with. But a good place to start could be to acknowledge the surreal qualities of the setting in which immunity as defense was first introduced. The meeting of a starfish and the citrus thorn under a microscope.
We would like to propose that Metchnikoff's scientific setting was actually a paraphrase on the famous line from the French poet Isidore Ducasse. Beautiful as the chance meeting on the sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissecting table.
Ducasse's long-form poem, Le Chant du Mal d'Aurore, was published a decade before Metchnikoff pushed the thorn into the starfish. The poem is full of violent images of bodily fragmentation, dismemberment, and psychic perversion, some of which I can identify with. Oh, if I could have defended myself with my paralyzed arms, but I believe they have changed into logs.
Ducasse died essentially unknown, but his chance meeting between the sewing machine and the umbrella on a dissecting table was picked up 50 years later by the Surrealists and became something of a Surrealist mission statement, as a defining structure of a Surrealist artwork that links two realities that by all appearances have nothing to do with each other in a setting that by all appearances does not fit them.
To me, in my world of blurred impressions and non-linear reading, this diagnosis makes perfect sense. Much more than spots on an MRI scan or a civil war. The sewing together of a fragmented reality. If I were to self-diagnose, my condition would be called surrealism.
And a better title for this talk might have been Beautiful as the chance meeting of a starfish and a citrus thorn under a microscope. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this impressive talk at many levels. Beautiful to go to surrealism, suddenly starting from immunity, bodies, and the self. I can start with some questions also. The first one is related to this idea of the self and the deconstruction of the self, and it's a kind of a stupid question. It's like how do you relate to the self being a duo? Is it a self? What do we have here, or is it a multiple construction with two bodies interconnected? How do you relate as entity to this concept of the self?
Well, I mean, I of course, as we say in the talk, I cannot relate myself to the idea of a war going on or a war being waged, and that goes for, I mean, very deep. I mean, it's I totally don't agree with that way of relating self to your surroundings. And I definitely don't relate the self as being a fortress at all. I mean, So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that opens up to all other questions of what the self is. And that is maybe a wider, more interesting discussion.
But of course, as our practice, it's been always something that is between us. And I think also the way that we've been starting to deal with the things that are happening in your body are also related to how they have affected us together and how it's been an experience that we've done over these 17 or 20 years that we work together. And so in that sense, of course, there is, the Goldin+Senneby is obviously not.
Yeah.
And then it's this connecting with this idea of immunity and your artistic practice. It's the system, this body, is also reacting, and in this case, we can see something. We can follow you in this process that is connected with the idea of the immunity, but it's also transformed to something else. And it's in this process that we can see now with these three colors, but it's in much more, that it's affecting you as in your artistic practice.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, I mean, the self in our experience is about the stitching together of fragments, and that is what we do. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, of course, like the maybe we're also at the point in our practice where we felt that these experiences that we've been making on a more interpersonal level, which haven't been very visible in our work previously, were difficult to avoid. So, yeah.
Yeah, and also this concept of fragmentation, that it's in all your practice from the very beginning, and it has been appearing, but and being also paradoxically generous with audiences, that you are offering several ways to enter to your practice, offering also criticality. So this fragmentation is also defining the way you are. At the same time that it's extremely brave to see you embracing the concept of immunity as part of the artistic practice.
I think the first time we presented work publicly related to these experiences was a year and a half ago in our show at Efflux, Insurgency of Life. And we talked about that show as a retrospective. And we talked about it as a retrospective of work that we never made, but could have made over the last 15 years. So I think in that sense, you're right that the explorations that we are dealing with at the moment have been there all the time, but maybe this is only now that we've been able to put words on them in this way. We put other kinds of.
Yeah.
And if there are people listening, if there's anyone listening on Zoom, you can also write questions.
Yeah.
Well, I will, while people are typing in their questions, I will just throw one. Let me see if I can formulate it. In your previous project, Headless, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think withdrawal was a central strategy, your position in relation to your project. A little bit like replicating offshore companies that also kind of withdraw from public view. And then going about the project, but also the writing process through proxies and delegation. And so it was always difficult to answer the question of where are Goldin+Senneby, yeah, in Headless, which kind of position do they occupy, at least at first sight. That was. And my question now is, this performance, everything we are talking about today, everything you spoke about, is somehow embedded also in a creative process that is also kind of entangled with the writing process of a new novel, or artist novel, as I would call it. But the strategy seems to me quite the opposite, like you are not withdrawing, but rather the opposite. You are really sharing something that, yeah, it's a very intimate experience, something that even for us is kind of hard to understand. You know, you explain it. So my question, I guess, would be how this different, opposite kind of a strategy plays out into the writing process of the new novel. Because the previous case, I think, we already see it as a whole that is behind, but now we are in the middle of it. And I wonder how your new or different strategy, which is the opposite of withdrawal, rather more like exposing and embracing these kind of intimate experiences as part of the work. Yes, how does it play out in the writing process?
I can just say that there, if we start with the similarities, we can also talk about how, as which Mart was also bringing up, the fragments which are being finding a way of being sewn together, which very much also was the Headless project, was also all these fragments that in a way came together in this specific way in the novel. And I think that the work we're doing now is also in a way working with the fragments. But as you bring up, the big difference is that our position has shifted. And maybe you can talk a little bit to that.
And I think that our position has shifted very much in the project artistically. Exactly what our position is inside of the novel, we don't know yet. That's not fully decided or resolved. But I think, as Jakob was saying, in a way, the similarities are also the relationship to the novelist has certain similarities. Of course, in Headless, it was very important that we had a ghostwriter we never met, etc. Here, Katie Kitamura, who is our collaborator, is someone we have met several times and talked to and have a kind of ongoing dialogue with. But we also are quite clear about, there's also a lot of similarities in how we try to stage situations for Katie that she can write from, and that we try to avoid, instructing her what to write. And so the kind of starting point of the novel is this, and we don't maybe need to go into the details of it, but there is this transgenic pine tree that has overproduces resin and kind of kills itself, and that's in a laboratory in Florida, and it's never been moved out of this laboratory because of restrictions around transgenic trees. It hasn't been allowed out of the laboratory. But after kind of 2-year legal process, we've been able to release one of these trees, and it actually arrived in Katie's home last week. That's the arrival of the tree and her becoming an authorized caretaker of this tree, which we have sometimes talked about as an autoimmune tree, is the beginning of the novel. And it's kind of the staging from which Katie writes the opening chapter of the novel. And this presentation that we made today is kind of a presentation in preparation for this trip, as you mentioned in the introduction, to Sicily, to Messina, together with Katie and together with this psychosynthetic healer and cultural theorist, Ed Cohen, whose work actually has been very influential on the lecture we gave. I mean, a lot of the thinking in this lecture is more or less taken from Ed's work, so we should also acknowledge that. But together with them and also a few other people, we will be spending time together in Messina, and that will be another kind of setting that we frame for Katie, and that she needs to, it becomes a problem for her maybe, or something she needs to deal with in how that unfolds in the narrative. Yeah, but yes, you're right, we are more present. We didn't used to talk. We're still a little bit rusty in terms of how to speak in public. So
we have a question from Freya Halbury. Is it possible that Jacob's realistic condition actually is the basis of or postulate for your common artistry?
Yes, it's possible.
It's possible.
It's possible is the answer. Yes, I love this kind of answers. I was also thinking, and thanks for the question, Freya. I was also thinking about temporalities and the fact that we have this pine tree and the longevity of vegetables is something that it can last forever. A tree can last forever.
Vegetables lasting forever.
Sorry,
Something
trees.
interesting.
Like how
Okay.
this all real that has another idea of how, or that has another personal conception of life, and also another conception of the self, probably. Like what's a tree? What's the condition of the tree? How the tree is going to be in the future, if that's an idea of future. Then I was wondering about this concept of time with your project. Like, how do you relate to it? And so the fact that we were talking about Messina being there in a situation, but it's a specific situation with some people, something going to happen there in between you. And how do you relate to this extreme, vast amount of time that starts with this starfish, and then it can end with this tree in the future?
Well, I think, should I start? Do you want to start, Simon? Yeah. No, I think I think that we are interested in our practice more generally be a lived experience, and that there are the work we do is over large amounts of time. And I agree with you in terms of our interest in trees. We also another tree work we're working on is also this, of course, this relatability, that it's something that you can see grow over time, and that has this it has different timeline, and it has a slowing down of time. And I think a lot of our work, even if it's kind of dealing with the things that happen in society that are accelerating, we try to do them in slow motion, and we're quite slow as artists. And I think what's also interesting, but we're also, from our first work that we did together, we also decided that when we embark on these kind of longer term frameworks, there needs to be an idea about how they can end from the beginning, because otherwise our experience is that we burn out. So that's also, I think, where the novel has been helpful for us, both with Headless and with this project, that it's the time of, and this is also a similarity between the projects, the time of writing the novel is the timeline of the duration of the artistic proposal as a performance. And obviously we don't know how long time that takes, but there is at least a kind of preconceived notion of an end. And I think
I can also mention, in terms of the tree, this specific tree, which also have a condition that mirrors the condition, an autoimmune condition that was introduced into the tree by genetic means. It was introduced in the laboratory. That puts the tree in a very precarious situation in terms of lifespan. And it's also, now that we have been through all the bureaucratic machinery of trying to release this tree from this laboratory in Florida, you also learn about all these Ducassian measures you need to take in order to destroy the tree if it turns out that it grows so much that it could actually pollinate other trees in the world. So the protocol they have is a very violent process of how the tree should be destroyed. So this specific tree has in theoretically a very limited amount of time. Then we don't know what happens through the process when we have released the tree. Maybe the tree will have another future. We don't know.
But there is a lot in the buildup of the novel has been also taking it into a domestic environment and making it a containment area has meant that Katie's whole family has had to go through this training program with the USDA, and they will have like yearly checks and interviews with her, and that she's taking all of the right measures. And at the moment, the tree is only allowed to live for 5 years because then it has to be destroyed unless there is an extension. So there are these legal boundaries for the lifespan of this specific tree.
And I can one extra question, sorry, but it's this idea of the tree and the 5 years. I remember this visit to a botanic garden, and this person was like responsible for the collection of the botanic garden, and how they were keeping everything alive forever, like keeping these seeds there to be possible to create this nature again if it's necessary. And then I was just jumping directly to a museum. Art. Museum is doing the same thing, keeping things for the future. But it's difficult to understand sometimes if present is part of the future or not. And how do you see this connection then with the trees, the longevity of the trees, and your artistic practice? Is it going to be in 5 years, this project? Is it something that's going to stay forever?
That's up for other people to. That's a question of reception, I think, but the longevity. But I think that, for us, it's the making of the novel that is the time. And I think the tree, we will only find out through the novel what things we could do with the tree. There could be, because there's also the tree itself was also developed, back to the question of these war metaphors, was also developed in the laboratory in Florida with funding from the US military, because it was part of an attempt to use synthetic biology to produce new energy sources, and it was part of the US strategy for energy independence before they started doing fracking. So there is also kind of a military history to the very production of this tree.
As with many other things.
Of course, and that's kind of everything.
Yeah, I think that we are fine. I just want to say that we are really happy having you here physically at Index, with some people that have been following you also on place. Good luck in the scene. I was just thinking that you also need to go to Michigan. As there were some
Lake Michigan, of course.
You should go there. I think sometimes random decisions are also part of this process. Thanks, Joanna and David, for your work here at the Book Lovers. Thanks to all the team at Index and the ones that have been following us today via Zoom. We will close the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.